Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Hilary Allen, and I am from American University, Washington College of Law. When I say it's a pleasure to be here, I'm actually currently in my garage. I wish I were there with you, but it's a pleasure to be able to share this material, this new paper that I'm working on with this audience in particular. And I very much would like to receive feedback. Unfortunately, we're not in a position where I can get direct feedback, but please do feel free to reach out to me. My email address is hjallen@wcl.american.edu. This is a project that I think is sort of the beginnings of something that I think is important, and I'd very much like to engage with people on how the project should be developed further. Okay. So the title of this particular paper is Payments Failure. But really sort of the paper starts with a broader discussion of operational risk and how that relates to how we deal with financial crises or will need to deal with financial crises going forward. So the initial parts of my presentation are not restricted to retail payments, notwithstanding that the examples that I use and some of the suggestions for regulatory reform that I give at the end will be oriented towards the retail payment system. But just generally speaking, if we think about our current conception of financial stability regulation, it's tied to our current conceptions or our historical experience of financial crises, which have really largely to date been credit driven, right? Things like, or phenomena like bank runs, credit crunches. These are the transmission mechanisms that cause problems from financial institutions themselves, and then allow those problems to spread from financial institutions to the broader economy. And this is something that just in the last couple of years, Bernanke has come back and really just driven home that it is the credit channels that that have made the financial crises of the past such a problem for our economy. So given that history, it's not surprising that financial stability regulation takes the form of things like deposit insurance to stop runs, special resolution mechanisms, and lender of last resort by the central banks to allow credit to keep flowing, at least to some extent, from financial institutions. All of these have been developed to deal with the confidence failures that precipitate credit crunches, as I said, both in terms of the credit that's extended to financial institutions and the credit that's extended by financial institutions. The question that I grapple with in this paper is, what if future financial crises, however, had different causes and transmission mechanisms, ones that were primarily operational in nature? How would our financial stability regulatory system hold up? So, to be clear, operational risks are already clearly recognized as a potential trigger for a financial crisis. There's a lot of work that's currently being done on how cyber attacks, and I know that this is a subject that this conference is dealing with in a lot of detail. There's a lot of speculation about how cyber attacks could be the trigger that precipitates a financial crisis. But what I think there hasn't been engaged with to the same extent is operational risk as a transmission mechanism. So in most of the literature and most of the discussion that I've seen in terms of cyber attacks, the question has been, well, what if a financial institution is felled by a cyber attack such that there is a run on that financial institution, and then that financial institution is forced to default on its contracts with other financial institutions? However, it's possible that operational risks could be the transmission mechanism as well as the shock for future financial crises. So here's where I'm going to start sort of giving examples from the retail payment system. So imagine if the integrity of a payments provider's systems and data were compromised, which could happen through a cyber attack, but it could also happen just simply through an unintentional glitch. If that payments provider systems go down, it might have a business continuity plan that involves routing its customers' payment instructions through other payments providers. However, if those other payments providers are similarly situated, For example, they might rely on the same infrastructure like the cloud, or they might rely on software from the same vendors, given that there's an increasing concentration of vendors of this type of software. So they could be similarly compromised by the same glitches. And even if we have only one financial institution payments provider that initially suffers a problem with its infrastructure, by diverting its payments traffic to other financial institutions as part of the business continuity plan, those other financial institutions could start to suffer because of the increased load. So even if they're not compromised to start with, the increased load from the diverted traffic could expose vulnerabilities at the alternative providers. And here I'm drawing in large part from analogy from the experience with power grids, which suggests that stressed alternative infrastructure will be more vulnerable to its own failure. It's the high stress of loads, it's the stress of high loads that typically brings about blackouts. So in these types of scenarios, financial stability measures that we have in the form of lender of last resort, deposit insurance, special resolution mechanisms, these aren't really designed to respond to this type of operational transmission of problems. Right? If regulatory measures are designed to inspire confidence, they could obviously address any runs, et cetera, that come with the operational failures, but the operational failures themselves are not going to respond to those types of mechanisms. So I think there is a limitation in our existing financial stability regulation in that it does not grapple with or reckon with the possibility for operational transmission of problems. And that's probably not surprising given our history. Right? We've never had a historical experience of this type of financial crisis. And so instead what we have is operational regulation that is not, it's financial stability oriented in the sense that the rules want to avoid operational risks being triggers for runs and things like that. But really the focus is sufficiently narrow that it's about requiring individual institutions to manage their own internal risks through governance, through policies and procedures, without thinking about how those internal risk management strategies might cause systemic problems. For example, there are regulations that require the business continuity plans that I already mentioned that involve the rerouting of payments traffic. But there hasn't been any thought about how those kind of business continuity plans could overload other providers. The tagline that I use on this paper is that our next financial crisis might look more like a rolling blackout than a bank run, and our regulatory measures aren't designed to deal with that. So to further point out, I think, the inadequacies in our existing approach to operational regulation is to draw an analogy with the micro versus macro prudential regulation that was developed in the wake of the last financial crisis. So before the last financial crisis, banks were required to take steps to ensure their own solvency. And basically the assumption was, as long as individual institutions remain solvent, the system as a whole would be fine. However, the asset sales that those firms engaged in essentially worked as fire sales, depressing asset prices system-wide, imperiling the solvency of other firms that had invested in those assets. So what we drew from the last financial crisis was an appreciation that a macro-prudential perspective was needed that would take into account the systemic consequences of individual firm actions. And I think we need a similar approach to operational risk. And that's why in this paper I advocate a macro operational regulatory strategy that takes into account essentially the possibility of cascading operational failures. The big question is, what would that look like? I guess the closest thing we have to any sort of macro operational regulatory strategy is Title 8 of Dodd-Frank and Regulation HH, which the Fed has has adopted to implement Title 8. So those pieces of legislation and regulation, they exist in part to address operational risks at critical financial market utilities, like, relevantly for this paper, CHIPS, which deals with retail payment clearing and settlement. But I argue in this paper that much more is needed in terms of macro operational regulation, particularly in the light of the fact that new payments technologies are evolving that do not depend on chips or any other regulated FMUs or financial market utilities. So this is going to be an interesting exercise developing macro operational regulation because there is no historical precedent. We know that for better or worse, a lot of financial regulation that has been adopted in response to something that has gone wrong as a result of a crisis. And what I'm arguing for here is to do something a little more prospective, to see that the increasing complexity in our financial technology is making these operational failures more likely, and that we need to start contemplating in advance the potential for operational risks to transmit, as a transmission mechanism for shocks through the financial system. But in the absence of a historical precedent, we need a new theoretical framework to guide us. And I actually think that the best way to go about this is to engage with the complexity science literature. And I sort of already alluded to this when I said that I rely a lot on the literature regarding rolling power failures. That is the literature of complex adaptive systems. That's the literature of cascading failures. That's the literature of normal accidents. And I think that that literature has a lot to tell us about what technological failures could mean for our financial system going forward. So what that literature tells us is that if we want a robust financial system, we need to emphasize several dimensions of that system. So the complexity science literature says that there's 5 different ways of being robust. There is reliability, there's efficiency, there's modularity, there's scalability, and there's evolvability. And these different dimensions, have to be, you have to pick and choose. So this is sort of the classic challenge that regulatory agencies in the financial sphere face, balancing competing objectives. So efficiency is certainly important, but if we're concerned with the robustness of the system as a whole, efficiency is actually a dimension that you don't want to prioritize too much. The more efficient a system is at performing its function, the more efficient that system is likely to be in sort of transmitting shocks through it and makes it more fragile. So if you want a more robust system, efficiency should not be the dimension that is prioritized, although of course you need some efficiency, a significant amount of efficiency. It's Pyrrhic if you have a system that is stable but doesn't work at all. Another dimension of robustness that the complexity science says should be downplayed to some extent, and this is a little counterintuitive, is reliability. So in fact, if you focus on making the components of the system hyper-reliable, and you don't think about how those components are likely to interact, you're actually making the system more fragile. Instead, if you want to emphasize the robustness of the system as a whole, the dimensions that you should be focusing on, according to the complexity science theory, is the modularity, scalability, and evolvability of the system, all of which deal with the ability of the system to adapt to changes. So to provide a little more color on these terms, the modularity of a system refers to its ability to cope with changes to the organization of the system's components. For example, a modular system can work in parallel or reconfigure well as necessary to avoid crashing the system if a shock occurs. The scalability of a system refers to its ability to cope with changes to size and complexity. And then finally, the evolvability means the ability to cope with changes to the system that are made over time. A system that is robust from an evolvability perspective, for example, can withstand unanticipated changes in usage. So in this paper, I use the framework that I've just developed to assess the contributions that, I first use it to assess the existing regulation of operational risk in essentially the bank payment system and find it wanting, although I do note that there are some helpful elements in the FMU and regulation HH approach to regulating chips. But then I use the framework to assess the contributions of new payments innovations like Venmo, Alipay, Bitcoin, Ripple, JP Morgan, and Libra to see if they are likely to improve the robustness of our overall payments ecosystem, or whether they're likely to sort of make things worse. So the overview of that analysis is that most of these types of payments technologies could have some benefits for the modularity of the retail payments ecosystem, to the extent that they provide alternatives to the existing bank-based system. But there is a big question mark regarding their scalability and evolvability, particularly when there's a distributed ledger with awkward governance mechanisms involved. So the upshot of this analysis is that we can't expect private sector innovation to address the possibility of cascading operational failures in our retail payments ecosystem. And instead, we need to start thinking about what macro operational regulation of this payments ecosystem would look like. So according to complexity theory, a system can be made more robust by implementing measures that improve redundancy, as well as considering the implementation of sensors and then feedback mechanisms that can respond to the output of those sensors, changing the system as necessary. I think that's sort of a good starting point, I guess, for what macro operational regulations should seek to achieve. Putting in place sensors, feedback mechanisms in response to those sensors, and then to the extent that you are unsure of how those are going to perform, having some redundancy built into the system to pick up the slack. So let's think about what some of these sensors and feedback mechanisms might look like in the retail payment space. Stress tests and war games regarding hypothetical operational failures, I think, should be implemented, just as they're already used for testing banks' robustness to credit-related shocks. So, we have the capital-oriented stress tests already. What would stress tests look like with regard to operational risks? Detailed postmortem should be conducted of any widespread operational failures that do actually occur, but I think we do need to be engaging with hypotheticals as well. And so I guess you can draw a distinction between the types of stress tests that are currently used and the ones that I'm suggesting. So the capital stress tests are trying to test a particular metric. Does a bank have enough capital to withstand a particular stress scenario? What I'm advocating for here is not that so much as to say, well, gee, what would happen if a bunch of things went down? In other words, instead of trying to answer a particular question, these stress tests should be geared up from observation. And I draw an analogy with the chaos monkey process that is used at Netflix, where they randomly shut down parts of the system to see what the consequences would be. I'm not suggesting we do that with retail payments. The stakes are too high, but maybe we can use simulations to randomly shut down parts of the payment system and see what the operational consequences are of those. So that would be sort of the beginnings of the sensor part of macro operational regulation in this retail payment sphere. Circuit breakers would probably be the types of feedback mechanisms that we would need to start considering, amongst other things. So if we see a problem occurring in real time with a particular institution and its ability to process payments, does it make sense to prevent it from carrying out its business continuity plan if the expectation is that doing so will make more providers of payments vulnerable? Perhaps payment holidays could be used to respond to reports of large operational outages, essentially preventing the rerouting of payments traffic in order with the sort of end goal of preserving the system as a whole. Now, admittedly, this would involve a lot of difficult distributional questions. To what extent is it justified that we shut down one bank and all of its customers are prevented from transacting in order to preserve the system as a whole? But these are questions that we are already reckoning with in other spaces. For example, PG&E, the electric company in California, had to reckon with these issues when deciding whether to preemptively shut down people's electricity in order to prevent wildfires. And frankly, as we work through this world of COVID, we're seeing a lot of these very difficult distributional questions being made. And these are questions that we should start thinking about in the payment sphere, I think, in advance, instead of making them on the fly when a problem actually occurs. So in terms of sort of figuring out these feedbacks and sensors, and also just simply studying operational glitches that have arisen at different financial institutions or payments providers, I think the Office of Financial Research is the natural candidate for many of these activities. I think it's very unfortunate that this entity has been decimated in recent years. I believe that it should be rebuilt, and hopefully with a particular focus on complexity science abilities and data science abilities. In other words, this institution will be much more valuable if it has more than just the lawyers and the economists. So it really just, I think in the light of the interdisciplinary nature of this conference, it works well to suggest the necessity for interdisciplinary collaboration on these macro operational regulatory processes. All of this type of regulation would be highly experimental, at least at the beginning. So I think it's therefore prudent to build in a decent amount of redundancy from the outset. In other words, we should have some means of being able to transact, even if there is a widespread payments outage. Given the economic fallout that would come from people being prevented from transacting for a prolonged period of time, perhaps the Fed could provide a payment system of last resort, similar to what some people have proposed of opening the Fed's ledgers up to retail accounts. Maybe it could do that, if not always, as a matter of last resort. Another alternative is perhaps Congress could move to require businesses to accept physical cash as an alternative payment method should the electronic payment system succumb to technological problems. So these are just the beginnings of what macro operational regulation of the retail payment system could look like. Like all financial stability regulation, such approach would not be a silver bullet, and it would not be expected to completely eliminate all cascading operational failures. But it would require, significant resources, and resources of a very different kind to those currently possessed by most financial regulatory agencies. As I already mentioned, I think complexity and data scientists will be crucial. And as a side note, I think it's an important research question about regarding the best way to integrate this type of expertise into our existing financial regulatory structure. So it's going to be expensive, it's going to be challenging, mistakes will be made, but given the economic and social costs of financial system failure, I think steps should still be pursued to reduce the likelihood of the failure of the retail payment system and mitigate any failures that might occur. I think even incremental improvements are worthwhile. So I guess to conclude, I think the retail payment system is critical infrastructure and should be treated as such. But what I'm very much interested in hearing more from people is about what other sort of parts of the financial system would benefit from this macro operational regulation, and what would it look like in those other contexts. So really, the big takeaway from my presentation, I hope, is that risks can be transmitted through the financial system through compounding technological glitches as well as the credit channels. This will have enormous implications for the future as our system gets more and more technologically complex. So we need to start thinking now about what macro operational regulation would look like, not just in the retail payment space, but in other spaces as well. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to engaging with you on this. Again, I'm sorry we can't do it in person, but I hope to have a robust conversation with many of you about this idea of macro operational regulation. Thanks very much.